This week's module looks at the French Revolution, which many historians see as the beginning of the modern age. During the French Revolution, we not only see the collapse of absolutism, but the rise of new forms of government, as well as new forms of dictatorship, all in an effort to address the issues of authority and running a society. The French Revolution begins in earnest with the calling of the Estates General in 1789. With the calling, each estate began to debate how the estates should meet, with the first two estates seeking to maintain their control of the political body. Now, historically, each estate had met with the king separately, and each estate got one vote. What that would mean is that the first and second estates would traditionally outvote the third estate. However, the king, Louis XVI, granted that the third estate would be doubled, but voting would still be by estate, ensuring the continued powers of the elites in the first and second estate. However, when Louis decided this, representatives of the third estate began to question this, undoubtedly thanks to the influence of numerous pamphlets that were published during this period. One of the most important ones is one that we read for this week. Abbaye Sieyès' What is the Third Estate? We can see in the debates that emerge around the third estate and around the Estates General, broadly speaking, how this began to influence policy and ideas. Indeed, the third estate petitioned the king for the right to vote by head rather than by estate. The king oscillated on this offer, choosing to meet with each estate separately according to custom. But his oscillations represented in many ways the various viewpoints of his court. For instance, his brother, the Duke of Orleans, was a radical, supportive of kind of revolutionary ideas, while his cousin, the Count of Artois, was an unapologetic absolutist who hoped to restore previous order. The meeting of the Estates General was to take place in May of 1789. When representatives were sent, they were sent with something known as the Cahiers de Doléances. These were grievance lists that the representatives were to address within the Estates General. Many of the Cahiers complained of local forms of despotism, such as the burden of seigneurial dues, as well as the cost of the judicial system that was unfairly placed in the hands of the elite. However, Louis only called the Estates General to meet over the issue of taxation. Nevertheless, the Third Estate, supported by radical members of the First Estate, began talking of reform and a written constitution. Sensing the more radical attempts to change the situation, Louis wanted to control it by locking the Third Estate out of the Assembly Hall and using the army to intimidate members of the Third Estate. However, representatives instead met at a nearby tennis court led by the representative Bailly, and together they pledged not to dissemble until a constitution was drafted, which marked a distinct shift from what they were elected to do. Some liberal members of the First and Second Estate sympathized with the ideas of the Third Estate and joined them, increasing the size of the representatives at the tennis court, which the representatives collectively called themselves the National Assembly. The National Assembly asked Louis to recognize its sovereignty and in essence claimed to represent the nation, which signified another break from absolutism. If you think back in the textbook, Louis XIV, one of his famous phrases was "L'état c'est moi," the state is me. So as the National Assembly was doing this, a famine developed in June due to harvest shortfalls from 1788. And as Louis weighed his options, a popular revolt broke out in Paris. During the night of July 12, 1789, 40 custom posts of Paris's 54 were burned down to the ground to protest the cost of grain. 2 days later, on July 14th, the townspeople stormed the prison in Paris, known as the Bastille, in an attempt to gain weapons to defend the National Assembly. Rumors were circulating that the king was sending the army in to take control of the situation, and the Bastille prison itself was seen as a symbol of royal despotism, even though at the time it held only 6 prisoners. The popular violence surprised many members of the National Assembly, despite how radical members shared the ideas of the people in the streets, who were known as the sans-culottes. The military as well played an important role in its response to the Bastille by not doing anything, showing that the army, in essence, had abandoned the king. The peasant revolts followed as well. One was known as the Great Fear in the countryside. So after famines and harvest failures in 1787 and 88, the countryside is gripped with rumors of roaming bandits. Many of these rumors placed the nobles in charge of these bandits, and the nobles were using them as marauders to control the population. Conspiracy theories were a big part of the peasant experience in France in this time, and bandits were seen as predators sent by nobles to exact even more money from the peasantry. Peasant revolts in the countryside in June and July made the food crisis in the cities even worse by disrupting the already limited supply. Now, in these revolts, the peasants burned down both chateaus and record dues, which were contained within the chateaus. Now, the chateaus were not occupied by the nobles who were in Paris to follow the proceedings there. So the peasants went in and they burned these chateaus to the ground in order to erase the debts that were owed to them. In light of all this, Louis recognized the National Assembly and asked the representatives of the First and Second Estate, still in the Estates General, to join it in an effort to kind of quell the situation. The National Assembly subsequently began the process of undoing privilege. On the nights of August 4th through the 11th, the National Assembly set in motion the end of the estate system. Late-night sessions held at the National Assembly allowed liberal representatives to put forward motions in the absence of more conservative noble representatives. By the end of the month, on August 26th, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen was passed, claiming that all men were free and equal and that social distinctions must be a product of social utility rather than, of course, just of birth. Within this context, I want you to think about the abolition of privileges reading and how that talks about the kind of undoing of this order in these small ways, growing incrementally to larger and larger ideas. The passing of these laws essentially created what was a constitutional monarchy in France. It's important to know that revolutionaries on both the political left and the political right first sought to retain Louis XVI and rule through him. However, a drafting of a constitution was going to be necessary, and the idea was that Louis would sign it and, of course, live by it. Once this was made known, however, Louis was very lukewarm to the reforms put forward by the National Assembly, and making a constitutional monarchy difficult to construct around him. Furthermore, there was a fear of counter-revolution as nobles increasingly left France with the idea of coming back when the revolution was over. This led women to march to the palace in Versailles in October of 1789 to quote-unquote protect the king by bringing him back to Paris. What all this showed was that royal powers were quickly eroding in France in 1789, and the National Assembly was gaining greater and greater control of French society. French society itself had changed dramatically. The end of venality in 1789 ushered in the new idea of meritocracy. Furthermore, rather than the king, the idea of a nation, a group of people who share common ideas and culture, brought together these various elements of society. There was a brief ebb within the reform movement in the Assembly in 1790 as more moderate members took control of the National Assembly. Nevertheless, the revolutionary government continued to attack institutions associated with absolutism, especially the Catholic Church. They would do this through what was known as the Civil Constitution of the Clergy in 1790, which required priests to swear their loyalty to the French state first, above all other institutions. This caused great anxiety among priests who were forced to sign oaths to the government and upset many of their followers who were worried by not remaining loyal to the church it would create spiritual concerns. civil constitution of the clergy revealed divisions within French society that continued after the Revolution and during the Revolution, especially over spiritual concerns. So, not everyone in French society was highly supportive of the Revolution. Indeed, at this point, we begin to see armed insurrections to protect the Catholic Church against the state. And these insurrections began in the kind of fringes or the frontiers, if you will, of French society, such as in Brittany and the Vendée, and lead to a French civil war between different factions within France over this issue of protecting the Catholic Church against the forced centralization of the Revolution. So it's important to note that, much like what English shows us about the American Revolution, these revolutions, the Revolution in France still has a lot of divisions within its society. As the revolution continues on, its outcomes begin to frighten absolutist leaders in Austria, Prussia, and Spain. Louis, believing to have allies there, attempts to flee France in 1791. And Louis, of course, he could not accept the monarchy as the revolutionaries were trying to remake it. Louis and his family had hoped to cross the border to join up with the Austrians and enlist the support of the Austrian emperor and reinvade France and reassert absolutist control. So on the night of June 21st, Louis, over in the middle of the night, sneaks away and gets almost to the borders and stopped in the small town of Varennes. He's recognized there, and the citizens of France believe it's their duty to take him back to Paris to escort him. However, the problem was back in Paris, he had left a note saying that he was going to return in victory, and so when he returns to Paris rather than fighting his own former subjects, this effectively ends the monarchy and brings him under house arrest in Paris. After this, republicanism and those factions within the National Assembly, they become more and more strong. So it's kind of radicalizes the revolution. And so this also makes the constitution that the French were writing, which was a constitution based on having a constitutional monarchy, problematic, since they wouldn't have a monarch to run it. For the sequestering of Louis XVI after 1791, other leaders in Europe become very concerned, leading to the proclamation by the Duke of Brunswick, which we read this week. After this declaration, French radicals storm the palace and take control of the Legislative Assembly, which is what the National Assembly was called at this point. And so popular sovereignty becomes the way of understanding power, and the Constitution of 1791, predicated upon a monarch, was suspended. And so managing power at this point becomes problematic as groups take direct action, and this undermines the notion of representation within the Republic. Furthermore, we see what's known as the levée en masse, which militarized French society. All single men between the ages of 18 and 25 were to be part of a reconstituted army. So this is different from the professional army that was under absolutism, and instead it's replaced by a volunteer army of citizens. And the revolutionary government convinced a large number of Frenchmen to recognize the importance of the war, essentially in its kind of existential threat to the revolutionary government. Nevertheless, the Austrian army invades and wins a series of battles until at the Battle of Valmy in September of 1792, in which the Austrian army is turned back. And after this, a republic is declared in that same month, and the king is placed under arrest. What follows this is an era known as the Reign of Terror. The king is going to be tried for treason and executed in January of 1793. And during this period, the European war expands as what's now known as the National Convention declares war on Britain, Spain, and Austria. Robespierre becomes the leader of the National Convention and establishes what are known as the Committees of Public Safety to rule over local governments. These committees are composed of 12 citizens. And the Reign of Terror occurs between 1793 and February of 1794. And in essence, it's fueled by paranoia against internal enemies and leads to the death of political opponents of the radicals, this more moderate group known as the Montagnards. During this period, between 10,000 and 40,000 are executed for various crimes of dissent, which is deemed counter-revolutionary, and the fact that a war is going on amplifies the paranoia of the convention. Also during this period, we see the French government taking radical steps to try to overturn all traditions. For instance, there's a creation of a new calendar that rejects the older Christian calendar, and the creation of new civic religions, such as the cult of the Supreme Being, with the idea being that all of these traditions are tied to an old world, and the French Revolution is trying to create something entirely new. Outside of France, responses to the revolution did not vary that much. At first, places like Britain were and the United States were very supportive of these reforms that were happening. And indeed, groups of British citizens held the French example up of an action of a group of people against despotism. Such observations were characteristic of a group of radicals who come out against the British government itself. And in fact, men like these formed societies to meet and discuss politics. Most famous of these societies was the London Corresponding Society, which was organized to have men who were left out of the political process have a say. In this group, they published works that heralded the efforts of radical ministers of parliament who sought reform. Others in British society felt that the French only operated according to natural laws in returning the authority to French people. So this is people like Thomas Paine, who is living in Great Britain at this time, and he publishes his Rights of Man at this time. So as we've seen with Paine before in the case of the American Revolution, Paine is a big believer in this idea of natural laws of equality, and so he invokes these in essence to justify the actions of the French against Louis XVI. However, as the French begin to turn to the terror and they execute the king, Paine, he finds himself in greater trouble in Great Britain, and indeed his book was going to be banned and he's going to be exiled. And once he arrives in Paris, he also begins to question his earlier observations. And after the execution of Louis XVI in January of 1793, this turns not only Paine, but many supporters in Britain against the French. Indeed, a lot of this troubled response from the British perspective had a lot to do with British nationalism and their own perceptions of their importance as compared to the French. So if you take a look here at this picture, this kind of gives you an idea of how the British saw themselves in comparison to the French, where everything that the British do are kind of good and proper and just, while the French are creating this monstrosity. And this kind of gives us an idea too of where Burke was coming from, another one of our readings this week. So think about this, take a look at this picture and kind of think about how this reflects even in Burke's ideas. So as many in British society turned against the French Revolution, those radical ministers who had been supportive of it, they had run into some political problems when France declares war on Britain in 1792. And so many worried that French revolutionary groups and those who supported them would bring this kind of awful revolution to Britain. So to counter such a threat, which was hardly real in the first place, the government suspended habeas corpus in order to keep control of the streets. And more than that, groups of government supporters, what were known as Church and King's mobs, made themselves felt through intimidation of more radical ministers in Parliament. Street violence between groups of royalists and radicals occurred throughout the 1790s. And in the end, radicalism, this kind of idea of supporting more democratic reforms, it fails to galvanize British commoners, although these ideas would come back later during the industrial period. Okay, so between the end of the terror and 1799, France and Europe, they remain at war. It's kind of an off again, on again war. France does not return the king to the throne after the end of the terror, and instead we get other forms of government, the directory, for example, and then we get the consulate. And what these are is essentially they continue to fight the war, but they do restore order in France through the use of repressive police activity. But the continued threat of foreign armies led many in the French government to call for a more stable regime that could deal with the military issue. And this is going to lead to the arrival of a very popular general by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. So Napoleon, he's going to become what's known as first consul in 1799. Essentially, he's going to be brought into the government, but he's going to share his power with two other leaders, a kind of tripartite government. Um, Now, Napoleon himself, he represents many of the values of the French Revolution, the idea of meritocracy. This is a man who came from nowhere and rose through the ranks and became a general within the army. And he believes in many of these things. So what he's going to be able to do is to codify a number of these ideas through a series of laws. And we'll talk about those in a bit here, known as the Code Napoleon. So after a coup d'etat, Napoleon essentially is going to be unchallenged. The other two consuls kind of fade away, and he rules France. He does hold elections, but these elections are far from free and show very little of the ideas of the earlier revolution. So, with Napoleon at the helm, we see numerous victories for the Napoleonic army between the years of 1801 and 1812. And as you look at the map here, you can see that Napoleon is able to control broad areas. He's able to kind of defeat challengers such as Austria and Prussia. He controls the Italian peninsula. He overthrows the Spanish government. Now, the idea is that he's coming and claims himself to be a liberator, but the reality is that he creates some pretty repressive regimes that are satellite states that are subservient to the French regime and to Napoleon's regime. Now, with these victories, Napoleon, in essence, transforms Europe. He destroys the Ancien regime, the former regime, these kind of absolutist states in numerous areas in the Italian peninsula, in Spain, and in the German states. And what it's going to do is it's going to bring these revolutionary ideas, whether he intends it or not, to these places. And so, in essence, he's going to kind of set in motion a kind of revolutionary spirit for the 19th century. So the conquest of Europe allows Napoleon to redraw the maps. He creates kind of entirely new states. And in these states, he creates something even more importantly. He creates the idea of nationalism within these states. So one of the important areas for the future of this class is that Napoleon sets in motion this idea of German nationalism. And he contributes to this in two ways. One, he establishes kind of native bureaucracy. So the idea is in these new German states that he creates, he also creates a bureaucracy based on merit. And so this allows non-nobles within these areas to finally participate in government, to gain experience, and they're going to be crucial in the development of these states in the future. And two, he imposes a single law code, what's known as the Code Napoleon, this series of laws that he himself created. And it brings this kind of formally diverse area into kind of a single political entity with a single set of laws, and these are going to remain in place even after his undoing in 1815. So what happens here is that Napoleon's decline really begins in Spain. The invasion and occupation of Bourbon Spain was achieved rather quickly. And by conquering Spain, Napoleon facilitated the collapse of the Spanish Empire, establishment of South American republics. But the forced secularization of Catholic Spain, Napoleon brings many of the ideas of the French Revolution with him, and the brutally repressive measures of the new police state caused a guerrilla war to erupt in Spain by 1809. And some of the very ideas Napoleon used to justify his invasion, the support of liberty, the belief in nation, and the ideas of justice were used by guerrilla leaders to spur on the war against the French. And other states fought guerrilla wars as well. And indeed, this is when Haiti is going to declare its independence from France in 1804. But the problem is that Russia itself remains outside. It's not defeated by Napoleon. He was not able to take his grand army. And when he did in 1812, his army was destroyed by the Russian winter, in essence, leaving Napoleon without an army. So the French Revolution, it attempted to solve this issue of sovereignty and where power came from through the concept of the nation. So the idea is that there are citizens of this nation, they were male, but they would decide for themselves what their government would be. And so in a sense, like this seemed to coalesce all these issues that have been at us for these first couple weeks. However, the issue was still in many ways unresolved because the revolutionary government itself took on so many forms: constitutional monarchy, republicanism, um, and of course a dictator under Napoleon. Um, Furthermore, the destructive nature of the Napoleonic Wars would create a fear of revolution in Western civilization during the 19th century, so leading to a quite conservative century, politically speaking, in the 19th century. So, but it's important to note that Napoleon's invasions nevertheless brought many of these ideas to many, many parts of Europe. So, in essence, expanding the French Revolution as a more like European event.